Welcome back to Workforce Education 538, Personnel Administration and Workforce Education. This is our first mini lecture, and this mini lecture will focus on the organization of schools, the HR function within schools, and will briefly touch on statutory impact and framework that is shaping labor relations and working with unions in schools in this particular mini lecture. We're using our class text as kind of the framework for the mini lecture. I want to also remind candidates to please take a look at the multitude of resources and information that's available to you in the Canvas website and on the e-reserves within the Canvas website. Also of note is the statutory bills and laws and acts that are included in the modules and materials that are available for you in the files in Canvas as well. The REBOR and PERHAX texts are going to be, again, very important as we move forward with the course because they provide excellent information. Having said that, let's get started. When we take a look at organizational dimensions, it's important to understand that personnel administration and the HR functions in school is one of the most foundational activities that occur and one of the most important issues that occur in relationship to administration and the workings of schools because it deals with human resources. And if you look at schools and school work, literally a large portion of what we do is invested in human capital. When we think about the organizational structure of HR departments, oftentimes we think of them as either an island unto themselves or potentially those of shared responsibility. In some cases, in large districts, obviously the HR department is in many ways an island unto themselves. They have a very set organizational structure. They have a very set aspect of roles and responsibilities and rules that they need to follow. And in frequent terms, they function within an HR department. Typically, though, what we'd like to see, particularly in CTE programs, is that there's a shared responsibility between administration, the HR department, the business department, and the function of schools. So important to understand that the HR program, the HR department, and the HR function with personnel administration is absolutely critical in what we do in CTE. The structural framework of public education and basically looking at the organizational design is something that is part and parcel of this first mini lecture. One of your first set of assignments in your first discussion post are going to be to speak to the organizational framework, the organizational chart, if you will, within your CTE setting. And so taking a look at the REBOR text on page 11 provides you with an overview of what a school system's organizational chart will look like. It's going to be important for you to take a look at the roles and the responsibilities within that. But again, kind of understanding the structural framework of public education is going to be important. Within that, I think it's important to understand both the federal and the state government's responsibilities and how we see this organizational structure from a perspective of managing, running, and working with schools delineate. The federal government has been involved in education for several years, since basically the inception, promoting and advocating for educational activities. In the Carter administration, we actually saw a cabinet level U.S. Department of Education evolve in the government structure of departments and agencies within the U.S. government. And so the Department of Education at the U.S. level occurred during the Carter administration and has a full-fledged Secretary of Education at the cabinet level within the president's administration. Also, it's important to understand that the U.S. Department of Education provides significant rule, policy, and agency support in the way of regulations to the U.S. government's policies and programs and legislative agenda. coming from Congress and also enacted by the support of the signature of the president. Having said that, states really under the U.S. Constitution have the constitutional responsibility of providing education within their own regions. The U.S. Constitution does not speak to education. It is considered a state's right. And so the state constitutions of the 50 states in the United States and the state legislature actually govern by and large what happens in the state regarding educational policy. Now, the U.S. Department of Education and congressional acts of support have impact and influence on what occurs because of funding streams and because of funding mandates and because of program design and policy structure as legislated. But it's the states that truly do have the final rule, if you will. And we'll talk more about that in federal policy. From there, we see the State Board of Education is overseeing what happens in states regarding the activities and actions of state legislatures passing policy, and also the agency requirements of the State Department of Education. So in Pennsylvania, you would have Pennsylvania's Constitution governing the processes and the policies of education. You would see the state legislature as providing bills that then become law, that are signed by the governor, that go into place and into practice. The state board having an influence on some of that policy, and then the State Department of Education, Pennsylvania's Department of Education, actually making sure that the agency is following and implementing what those rules and laws are. At the local level, you typically see a Board of Education. Generally speaking, these are elected officials. They oversee the education department at the local level, and the local educational agency, the school system with the superintendent, actually implement the policies that occur from the federal to the state to the local. And career and technical education, you see career and technical education setting and following local rule if they're comprehensive in nature, and if they're CTCs, regional in nature, they're going to be working with a joint operating committee with CTE administration, and then ultimately the program services in CTE. So kind of an overview of what happens with the organizational dimensions of the school, from federal to state, from state to local, and from local to parameters that have governance and impact on CTCs and career and technical education. So we move forward. It's important to take a look at the reform agenda and how this has had an impact on administration, particularly CTE administration. Just a quick example of federal to state to local. In No Child Left Behind, this was the education reauthorization of the Elementary and Secondary Education Act under the Bush administration. We saw No Child Left Behind providing substantial opportunity for educational reform in the ways of developing standards and implementation of accountability that was governed by the U.S. Department of Education. In a more recent reauthorization of the Elementary and Secondary Education Act under ESSA of 2015, the Every Student Succeeds Act, what we saw was a revisiting of the assertion of states' rights. And so if you look at accountability measures, if you look at testing and standards development, if you look at the implementation of college and career readiness plans, which have an impact with career and technical education, you're going to see that the states have significantly more impact and say in those initiatives than they did under the No Child Left Behind Act. And so, again, just movement from federal to state. There are other pieces of educational legislation that also follow this same kind of reform initiative. And if you look at the Perkins Act in its most recent reauthorization in 2018, you're going to see that the reauthorization aligns with the Every Student Succeeds Act, and the language is also mirroring, in many cases, the language that comes out of WIOA, which is a 2014 U.S. Department of Labor piece of legislation that has impact on workforce development. So again, other pieces of legislation also are going to be important as we take a look at human resources, personnel, and administration in CTE. The responsibility of boards of education is to make educational policy, and in taking a look at that, the practice is governed by what's happening at the federal level that needs to be implemented at the local level, what's happening at the local level and the wishes of the local school system, what's happening with the State Department of Education, and what's happening with state policy, typically coming from state legislatures and laws and bills that are passed by the governor and put into place. These are the responsibilities of what local boards of education policy making involve. Administrative procedures consider the aspects of a theoretical framework where we're looking at social justice and we're looking at ethical practice. The roles of the administrator is to make sure that the function of schools and the role of education and educating America's youth within the school system are actually carried out, and they're done so following social justice and equal opportunity, but they're also done so in following ethical practice and best practices and following standards in relationship to education and teaching and learning. Interestingly enough, when we think of the organization of central office, we basically think of three key roles that are played, and these roles have impact on the role of the CTE administrator, the director, the executive director of CTE settings. Chief advisor typically is the role of consulting and advising the board on policy and practice. Executive officers typically are the aspect of making sure that the rules and the policies are put into place and are actually executed within the school so that they are coming to fruition and put into practice. And then educational leadership typically is leadership at the top, superintendent in the school district or school corporation, the executive director under a CEC, CTE setting. But these folks basically need to be involved in informing stakeholders of policy, of school practice, of school achievement, of school accountability, and of school activities that are going on. And this is a leadership role, informational in nature. All of these aspects, again, are important for the CTE leader and are important in personnel administration and the HR role within schools. When we think about human resources administration, it's going to be important to understand the full complement of the HR function within school settings. And the HR function within school settings involves a lot of different things, but some of the key pieces are taking a look at human resource planning, planning on what is going to be priorities within the school district, what are going to be the needs within the school district, and making sure that we plan within the school district to have those things come to fruition. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a couple of minutes here in this mini lecture. Recruitment and selection of candidates is absolutely critical in making sure that you have teachers that fill the role and that the teachers that do fill the roles are the best teachers for those roles. Placement and induction programs, making sure that new teachers are acclimated to their job, that they have an induction program that is affording them the opportunity to get acclimated with a mentor, with school support systems, that staff development and professional development activities occur to meet the needs of staff within schools and to meet the demands and challenges that schools are facing, all central around staff development and professional development to support teachers in schools and staff in schools. Performance evaluations also are something that become part of the personnel file of individuals that are working within schools and basically can be used to assist in staff development, professional development planning, but also are used in relationship to hire fire. And those are important aspects, obviously, as well of the HR function. Obviously, compensation and looking at collective bargaining and negotiations are also part and parcel of the human resource function in schools. Human resource administrators have a wide range of responsibilities and roles, and typically these are fleshed out at the local level based on need of the schools and the school districts and the CTEs there. The textbook provides some good background information to take a look at what some of those roles and responsibilities are, and I invite you to take a look at the information that's in the text on page 14 through 18 in the Rebor text. When we think about leadership theory, we talked a little bit about that. We'll talk more about this in other classes, but really the HR function and HR administration has a transcendental leadership theory that has application. HR function is very complex and in many cases is unwieldy and in some cases is ambiguous, and it does follow in line with systems and structural theory as far as organization. Within that, you see the HR administrator basically being required to do a variety of expectations within the job, none of which is the least important as making sure that they are correctly and accurately following federal and state law as it's delineated in a statutory framework, and we'll talk a little bit about that. But these vast roles and responsibilities really also are a critical aspect in transcendental leadership. And then another piece to this is just the fact that in working with boards of education are designed to provide policy and government approaches to schools, but typically, frequently, they move into having some aspect of administration and impact on administration. And so when we think about leadership in HR, flexibility is and basically understanding the complexity are going to be key pieces. Another aspect of this is total quality management, and there are 14 components of TQM that are identified that align with HR functions within schools. I think the key with this is that we really want to look at quality control and cost factors along with best practices in HR. We'll spend much more time looking at leadership theory in taking a look at Workforce Education 508 as part of our CTE leadership program here at Penn State, and that's basically workforce education management. It's a full course that will talk much more about these issues, but just as we think about HR and we think about the function within schools, it is going to be important to understand transcendental leadership and also TQM as structural framework, theoretical framework that support the HR administrator. Human resource planning, I said that I would get back to this, and I think it's important to just kind of hit some highlights. Again, by no means is this a deep dive, but this is an opportunity to just provide you as candidates with some talking points to spend some time with. Typically, there's an absolute need to assess what the human resource needs within the organization are going to be, and this can be done through taking a look at human resource inventories, doing surveys, working with stakeholder groups to find out what the needs are within schools. Enrollment projection is another area that's going to be very important, taking a look at the number of students that are coming into programs in CTE. It's going to be very important to use enrollment predictions based on program growth and program need, taking a look at the review of school district policies, the strategic plan, the objectives and the goals, and making sure that the human resource planning is aligning with what those visions are and the mission maintains, particularly in CTC programming. Human resource forecasting. This is another important area where basically in human resource forecasting, we're going to be finding out from our stakeholder base, community, parents, teachers, staff and administrators what the needs are going to be. Important here with CTE programming and planning, with HR forecasting, is taking a look at what the industry needs are within your local community and within your regional area, and then forecasting programs and services and supports, and making sure that there are personnel that are able to fill those needs in high demand jobs or high areas of need as far as employment are concerned, and aligning that with program services at the CTE. Looking at supply of human resources is also going to be interesting. The key with that is to just make sure that there are plenty of applicants for new positions that are available, and that you're adequately meeting the needs of people who are coming back from sabbatical, people who are coming back from medical leave, people who are coming back from medical service, military service. It's important to just make sure that there are support structures in place there, and also matching the need with supply. What is it that you have for supply side issues within the school, and then matching the HR needs in relationship to those supply sides. Another aspect of human resource planning is really taking a look at reduction in force, and RIF activities in schools are not uncommon. Unfortunately, you see a reduction in force through budgetary constraints, typically also forecasting retirements and those kinds of things, or program and population parameters as far as enrollment predictors are all going to come into play in looking at potential reduction in force. There are also alternatives to reduction in force, and these are basically looking at creative ways to do forecasting and projection, taking a look at potential opportunities and options for faculty to move from one position to another in relationship to contractual arrangements, but also in response to job security issues by rank and file. These are key pieces to take a look at. And last but not least is the role of the principal, the role of the CTE administrator, the role of the executive director in a CTE setting in relationship to human resource function. If the CTE administrator does not handle these processes of business management and HR function within their CTE, they need to be directly involved in that and understand, so that they can provide administrative management and administrative leadership that's best going to align with the human resource needs and align with human resource planning of their school and organization. We move forward to taking a look at the federal influence on HR planning. And again, I talked a little bit about social justice and HR administration and the theory of justice. In looking at this, we really need to be well aware as CTE administrators of civil rights and the civil rights movement, aligned with the needs and the rights of individuals within that context. The civil rights movement has sprung to the issue of the theory of justice and social justice, which are critically important. They provide equal opportunity and equal access, which are key elements of the U.S. Constitution, which governs the interplay really of all institutions within the United States, and providing opportunity for all individuals in the United States. And so the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Rehabilitation Act of 1973, and the Americans with Disabilities Act of 1990 are great examples of social justice and theory of justice, and how it has impact on hiring practices, on human resource administration in schools. Additionally, it's important to understand the affirmative action elements that are framed within this broader context of federal and state statute. Affirmative action is indeed a U.S. Federal set of laws and activities, and it has historical roots that go back to both the definition and its inception of the 1964 Civil Rights Act, of which the Equal Opportunities Employment Commission was part of this process. The EEOC has an 8-step process that provides guidance to schools in making sure that equal employment opportunities and affirmative action elements are met, and there is an affirmative action officer in every school setting. It's important to understand that the EEOC administrative process in basically taking a look at making sure that affirmative action and equal opportunity are provided in school settings, including CTCs and CTE settings. It's important to make sure that if there is a charge of discrimination, that is addressed and that it is investigated through a board that is established and a process that's established at the local level, and that they basically, in the investigation process, make a determination in relationship to the elements that were there. Basically, there's a process for looking at conciliation. Conciliation is reaching an agreement or consensus, and if that is not reached, then there is an opportunity for this to move forward with litigation, and there's a litigation division that is responsible for this. Also, there's a bona fide occupational qualifications issue that is very important. The text does a nice job of explaining this, particularly as it relates to schools and colleges, and it deals with gender, religion, and national origin, and whether or not there is an occupationally qualifying definition with potential EEOC and discrimination activity. So it's important to pay attention to what the parameters are around schools as they identify with gender, as they identify with religion, and as they identify with national origin. But it's important to also understand that there is judicial review of affirmative action, and there is civil rights and legal court proceedings that can occur with this, and there are rules and regulations that govern this. All of which is to say, this is a federal issue, and it comes from the federal government, and it has its roots in the 1964 Civil Rights Act. There are also state governance issues in relationship to equal rights and policy and practice at the state level, and that school districts and school settings have policy and practice that is in line in making sure that affirmative action and equal opportunity are steps that are in play and steps that are in process. And this is a major function of HR and a major issue in relationship to HR planning and practice. So elements here are going to be critical for you to understand the impact and the processes that govern what we do in schools. And interestingly enough, this is an aside, your school setting and your school district should have an affirmative action officer. There should be a committee set up. There should be policies and practices in place, and there should be procedures that are well known by all who are within the schools around this issue. It might be interesting to just query some of your colleagues in relationship to their understanding of equal employment opportunities and affirmative action, and then what the issues are within schools. Progressive schools have made sure that this information is well known and that the policies and procedures are well understood, and that these are revisited at least on an annual basis. And so those are some suggestions that I would have as you move into your profession and your career as CTE administrators. Also want to take a look quickly at just the statutory framework. And again, we in this mini lecture won't go through each one of these, but I want to read these various pieces of statutory rule and regulation and invite you to spend time doing a deeper dive with these, because as we look at the HR function in schools, directors of CTE settings need to be aware of how these statutes have an impact on what we do with human resources and the issues of working with people who are employed in our school setting. The Civil Rights Act of 1991, the Equity of People with Disabilities Act, the Americans with Disabilities Act of 1990 and its subsequent amendments in 2008, the AIDS and Discrimination Transformation Act, the Vietnam Era Veterans Readjustment Assistance Act, mobilization of military reserves and the National Guard into active duty, the Omnibus Transportation Employee Test Act of 1991, the Family and Medical Leave Act of 1993, the Equity of Women's Act, sexual harassment statutes and regulations, the Equal Pay Act, and the Equity by Age Act are all areas that have statutory framework, statutory rule and regulation that impact what we do and how we do it in public schools concerning human resources and taking a look at the issue of personnel administration. So please take time to look at the textbooks on this. Please take time to look at the number of resources that I have in Canvas on this under the statutes that include also Pennsylvania rules and acts that encompass much of this work, and also take a look at the federal legislation that is out there and the acts that have occurred subsequent to this statutory framework. It's going to be important for you to understand. Understanding those pieces, we're going to shift gears and take a look at labor relations in the basics, because much of the HR function in schools deals with labor relations as well. By nature, human aspects, if you will, looking at employees and employers, the nature of human relations can be somewhat adversarial. In schools, we look at school boards and also the teachers' unions or unions representing the stakeholders within school settings. Typically, when we think of these relationships, what we'd like to think is that the school board and the unions in labor negotiations would find common ground, would find common place, would be able to move forward without significant issue. But in many cases, the school board and the school union have, in some cases, differing views on what would be the governing factors that would be appropriate for labor relations. And so there is an adversarial relationship in some cases dealing with what employers, meaning management, want and what employees, usually represented by unions, would like to have. And so finding common ground is going to be a word of advice for best practices in CTE administration and for schools and their labor union, labor relations endeavors. Looking at this, the union representatives typically have, in general cases, somebody who is qualified or classified as a facilitator. This is the person that wants to find the deal, wants to find the common ground, wants to get things done. They have a committee chairman. This is the person that typically is the leader of the union, the point guard, if you will, provides what's best for the union in relationship to their representation. Typically works very closely with rank and file and union membership. And in some cases, there is sometimes in union representation somebody who's an antagonist. And this is somebody who is clearly advocating for the union, advocating for certain positions, may have an agenda item that they see as most important. Typically, they are going to fight tooth and nail for what they believe in. And in many cases, they're seen as a zealot. These are, some of the roles that union representatives will play in their negotiation processes. As far as the board members are concerned, typically there can be somebody who represents an appeaser. They're somebody who wants peace. They want to find common ground. They want to find a place where there's harmony, where the relationships and the process in negotiations can be on equal footing, but yet on footing that is non-controversial. Sometimes there's a crusader, and a crusader is a person that has a strong belief, a strong approach. They may have an issue or an area that they are representing in a base of constituency where their vision and their willingness to work with the union is going to be maybe more direct, if you will, could lead to more elements of confrontation or potentially more elements of concern, if you will. But a crusader typically has an agenda and has a cause, if you will, and is going to move that agenda forward. And last but not least, there's a labor council. Typically, the board is going to work with their solicitor or their attorney. Their attorney's group is going to have somebody who is very well versed in labor negotiations representing the school board. And so that labor council is going to be a liaison to the board in making sure that many of the rules and the regulations are under Pennsylvania's Labor Relations Board are going to be followed, and that affirmative action issues and making sure that the approach to a fair and equitable contract are followed. The superintendent is basically going to be the CEO. As the superintendent is involved in these negotiations, their interest is just making sure that they have a responsibility to understand labor issues, understand labor negotiations, understand the HR function, and to become a spokesperson and the person that is making sure that the process is moving forward and that negotiations do come to an end game that is amicable for all involved. Again, the school board and the union are going to be those that are going to be in direct negotiations. The superintendent is in the CEO within that process. And then last but not least, taking a look at bargaining units and organizational activities in relationship to labor relations, no pun intended, is going to be governed by the Pennsylvania Labor Relations Board. As we move forward with Workforce Education 538, we will spend more time kind of looking at these dynamics, particularly when you get to your fourth project in our course, which is dealing with the union and negotiations and the actual signed agreements between administrators, between teachers, and between professional staff, those three representative groups. So we will spend more time in looking at labor relations and understanding that with a deeper understanding as we move forward with the course. Additionally, it's important to just talk about Pennsylvania's statutory framework. And again, here, what I'm trying to do with the first mini lecture is follow along with the text information, particularly the information that is representative of the Pennsylvania School Board Association, the per-text text. This is important to understand, and there is great information. And again, as I say, on the Canvas webpage within the modules and also in the files, there's a whole file on statutory information there for you to review. But Pennsylvania's Act 195 is the Public Employees Relation Act, known as PERA. It's a 1970s piece of legislation that governs what happens in schools around employee relations and looking at contract negotiations and those issues. It was updated in 1992 with the passage of PA Act 88, which revises some of the processes for school employee negotiations. A governing factor here is the unfair practices that are defined. Again, our textbook on page 15 provides specific information that is related to this under the Pennsylvania Employee Relations Act. Unfair practices are typically designed and articulated in 9 key areas, and I invite you to review those as identified by the text and also by statutory framework. Interestingly enough, when we look at the issues of there being a complaint charged, there is a procedure that occurs, and the procedure that occurs is that complaint must be, or that charge must be filed with the Pennsylvania Labor Relations Board within a 4-month period, and that's filed in Harrisburg. Typically, there are remedies that are sought. The Pennsylvania Labor Relations Board reviews these cases and reviews reviews the issues at charge, and they make recommendations and they find remedies. And in many cases, they may make a whole remedy decision on a charge that's been filed. And an example of that would be if, for example, there are economic issues in a contract where the contract negotiations did not provide pay increases because a new contract wasn't signed, and so the old contract becomes the contract that has been used, and labor unions are in working conditions where they're being paid under the old pay structure. A make whole provision would be that if the following year they worked under the old pay structure, and yet the negotiated terms for the new pay structure would provide them with resources that would provide back pay. There are a variety of examples where a make whole remedy might be the decision making that comes out of the Pennsylvania Labor Review Board's decision making under establishing remedies. Also, an important piece here in looking at the PA statutory framework is understanding the concept of deferral. And this typically occurs when there is an issue where there is a charge of an unfair labor practice, and also the union is bringing forth a grievance violation of the contract. When these two things occur concurrently, deferral simply means that the Pennsylvania Labor Relations Board will defer the judgment on the unfair labor practice until the grievance issue aligned with the violation of contract is addressed, and then they'll move forward with the unfair labor practice remedies and decision making. Details on that are on page 19 in the text. Again, what this does is it provides a very thumbnail overview of the beginning chapters of both of our texts as we begin the discussion about the function of the HR role, taking a look at the serious and critical area of administration in CTE settings and in school districts, looking at personnel administration, and then some of the governing aspects that are aligned with this. I think it's important for candidates in 538 to understand the organizational structure, the roles and responsibilities of the school district and the policies and practices that support that. I think it's important for them to understand the governance framework from the federal to the state to the local, particularly looking at JOCs and their policies and practice under the CTCs in the state of Pennsylvania. I also think it's important to understand the aspects of and the multitude and the complexities of human resources in public education, and then the statutory framework that supports that, both at the federal level, dealing with civil rights and dealing with equal opportunity and affirmative action, and the multitude of federal pieces of legislation that have an interplay with schools and HR function and personnel administration in schools, and then the Pennsylvania statutory framework as well. Again, an overview for you. The course will spend much more time looking at and talking about this as we do a deeper dive. Those assignments associated with 538 will also provide you with a great opportunity to have an opportunity to grasp the concepts and knowledge more appropriately and more specifically related to your CTC. Having said that, I look forward to continuing to work with you. This is the end of our first mini lecture, and I'm anxious to move forward as we continue our work in personnel administration and HR function as part of the Penn State CTE Leadership Program. Thank you.